The Frozen
Silas.
Frontier, a tale
I
of
know what
embers
they
and
did.
justice.
You need to
Scene
come with
1,
me.
the dying
Clara, you
fire.
shouldn't be
A freezing
here. It's
desert
not
night,
safe.
a lonely traveler beside a dying fire. Then a trembling voice from the darkness whispered, "May I warm myself by your fire?" What happened next would change both their lives forever. Welcome to Frontier Legends,
Silas.
where the dust of the horizon carries stories of courage, sacrifice, and unforgettable lives. Hit the subscribe button and never miss the next epic Western stories. The wind came down the plains that night like a tired ghost wandering the desert, dragging sand and silence with it. Outside a lonely line of willow trees near the dry bed of Snake River, a small fire flickered against the darkness, its orange glow trembling in the vast emptiness of the frontier. Silas Vance sat beside it with his back against a saddle and his hat tipped low, a weathered drifter who had ridden more miles than most men cared to remember. His horse grazed nearby with slow, patient movements, while the sky above stretched wide and star-filled like a story too big for words. Silas had been alone for weeks, driving stray cattle north for a rancher who paid in silver and silence. Out here, a man learned to listen to the wind more than people. That was why he heard the sound long before he saw her. A faint rustle of boots over dry grass, slow, careful, almost afraid of the night itself. His hand drifted near the revolver resting by his knee, though he did not draw it. The fire popped softly as the figure stepped into the dim light. She looked no older than 25, wrapped in a faded shawl that had once been crimson, but now carried the color of dust and long travel. Her hair hung loose and tangled around a pale face touched by exhaustion. For a moment, she simply stood there, the flames reflecting in her tired eyes. Then she spoke so softly the wind almost stole the words away. "May I warm myself by your fire?" Silas studied her without moving. In the West, a stranger in the dark could mean trouble, sorrow, or both. Yet something in her voice held a kind of broken honesty that guns could never imitate. After a moment, he nodded toward the flames. "Fire don't belong to me. It belongs to whoever needs it." Scene 2. Two strangers meet. She stepped closer slowly, as though afraid the invitation might vanish. When she lowered herself beside the fire, her hands trembled slightly as she held them near the warmth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crackle of burning wood filled the quiet, while the prairie wind rolled across the empty land. Silas finally pushed a small tin cup toward her. "Coffee is gone bitter, but it'll warm your bones." She took it carefully with both hands. "Thank you, Mr. Silas," she nodded. "Clara." Her voice carried a soft southern trace, the kind you hear from towns that sit beside slow rivers and old churches. He noticed the dust on her boots and the thinness of her coat. "You've been walking far tonight, Clara." "Since sunset, where you headed?" She looked into the fire instead of answering. Silas had seen that look before in drifters and soldiers and widows. The look of someone whose road behind them burned hotter than the road ahead. Finally, she spoke. "Anywhere the past can't follow." Silas scratched the stubble on his jaw. "Ain't many places like that out here. The prairie remembers everything." Clara gave a faint, sad smile. "I believe that." Scene 3. The ghost of the past. Silence returned for a while. The flames painted shifting shadows across Silas's lined face and across Clara's tired eyes. Somewhere far off, a coyote called to the night. After a while, Silas said quietly, "Folks don't wander the plains alone unless something's chasing them." Clara's fingers tightened around the cup. "My husband died last winter." Silas tipped his hat slightly in respect. "I'm sorry." She stared into the fire again. "It wasn't sickness. It was men, outlaws who rode through our ranch looking for money we didn't have. My husband tried to reason with them." Silas waited. She swallowed slowly. "They burned the barn, took the horses, and when he stood in their way, they—" She stopped speaking for a moment and breathed in slowly. Silas did not press her. After a moment, she continued. "The sheriff said he'd track them, but he never did. Said there were too many gangs roaming the territory. I buried my husband myself beside the oak tree near our house. Then I left before winter ended." Silas stared at the fire, but his jaw tightened slightly. Clara noticed. "You've seen men like that before, haven't you?" Silas let out a slow breath. "More times than I care to remember." She looked at him curiously. "You're not just a wandering cowboy, are you?" Silas shrugged. "Once I wore a badge in a town called Black Creek. Marshal for 6 years till one day I realized the law sometimes rides slower than evil." Clara studied him with quiet surprise. "Then why'd you leave?" Silas's voice turned low and steady. "Because a man can only bury so many good people before he starts wondering if the desert might swallow him too." Scene 4. The name in the wind. Clara watched the fire for a long time. Finally, she spoke again. "The men who killed my husband wore yellow scarves over their faces. 5 of them. Their leader had a scar running across his cheek like lightning." Silas's eyes lifted slowly toward her. "You remember his name?" She nodded faintly. Jedediah Thorne. The wind seemed to pause for a moment, as though the prairie itself recognized the name. Silas stared into the fire, but something inside him shifted. Jedediah Thorne was a ghost of the frontier, an outlaw whose trail ran through half the territories, leaving burned ranches and empty graves behind. Clara noticed the sudden stillness in Silas's posture. "You know him, don't you?" Silas spoke quietly. "I've crossed paths with him years back." Clara's eyes sharpened with sudden hope, mixed with pain. "Then you know where he rides." Silas shook his head slowly. "Men like Thorne don't stay in one place long enough for justice to catch them." She lowered her gaze again. "I figured as much." Silas watched her for a moment before saying gently, "Why do you tell me all this, Clara?" She looked up with a quiet desperation. "Because you look like a man who understands loss, and because sometimes strangers carry more mercy than the world does." Scene 5. A shared mission. The fire cracked loudly between them. Silas leaned forward and placed another piece of wood into the flames. "You asked if you could warm yourself by my fire." She nodded. Silas looked directly at her for the first time. "Clara, you ain't just warming yourself by my fire tonight. You're warming yourself beside the man who's been hunting Jedediah Thorne for 7 years. Clara stared at him as if the world had suddenly tilted. Silas continued quietly. "I followed his trail across 3 territories. Not for money, not for the law, but for people like your husband. For widows who deserved better than silence." Emily's breath caught slightly. "You mean?" Silas nodded once. "I mean, I planned to find him." For the first time since she had stepped out of the darkness, the night felt less empty. And far across the plains, a man named Jedediah Thorne rode beneath the same stars without knowing that fate had quietly shifted. Scene 6. The Choice. The fire settled into a slow glow. Clara stared at Silas as if trying to decide whether hope was something she dared to believe in again. Eventually, Silas rose to check his horse. When he returned, he handed her a small piece of dried meat. "It ain't much, but it'll keep your strength up." "Thank you, Silas." "What happens if you find him?" she asked. "Then the running stops," Silas replied. "Not with bullets or blood, just with the end of the road." Emily looked back at Silas with a mixture of fear and courage. "Then take me with you." Silas blinked once in surprise. "Clara, no. I'm serious. I've spent months running from the past. Maybe it's time I stopped running." Silas shook his head. "Tracking a man like Thorne ain't a journey for someone carrying fresh grief." "Fresh grief is exactly why I need to face it," Clara said with sudden strength. Silas sighed. "Dawn's coming in a few hours. We'll ride to the town of Dusty Ridge. There's a preacher there named Gideon Pike who owes me a favor. He'll help you find a safe place to stay." "So that's it," Clara said softly. "You send me off and ride away alone again. If you ride away without me, I'll still follow the trail myself. I may not know how to track outlaws, but grief can teach a woman more than you think." Silas chuckled softly. "You remind me of my sister. She ran a ranch harder than most men and scared half the cowboys in Texas." "All right, Clara," Silas finally stood. "You win this round. But understand this, the road ahead ain't kind. Thorne rides with dangerous men, and the closer we get, the darker things might become." "My life has been dark since last winter," Clara said, rising to her feet. "At least now it has direction." Scene 7. The Confrontation. After several weeks of travel, Silas and Clara finally receive word from an old ranch hand that Jedediah Thorne and his gang are hiding near Shadow Canyon deep inside a deserted valley. Under the cover of night, the two of them quietly approached the valley. In the distance, a small campfire flickered, where a few riders sat talking. One of them had a long scar across his cheek. The very man who had destroyed Clara's life. Silas spoke softly beside her. "Remember, Clara, we didn't come here for revenge. We came to write the ending of this story." Within moments, the valley was surrounded by the sheriff and several ranchers Silas had gathered. When Jedediah Thorne realized there was no escape left, he slowly stood up. For the first time, the arrogance was gone from his eyes. Silas stepped forward. "Jedediah Thorne, I've been waiting 7 years for your ride to end. Tonight, your road ends here." Thorne lowered his weapon. Clara stepped forward, tears filling her eyes, but her voice strong. "You burned my home. You took my husband from me. I thought my heart would be filled only with hatred. But today I learned something. Justice is greater than hatred." Scene 8. The Sunrise. A few days later, Silas and Clara returned to the very place where they had first met. The same tree, the same open field, and a new fire burning. The morning sun slowly rose. Clara sat beside the fire and smiled gently. "If I hadn't asked you that night whether I could warm myself by your fire, my life might have stayed in darkness forever." Silas replied with a faint smile. "Well, sometimes fate doesn't knock on the door. It simply arrives as a question." "What question?" Clara asked. Silas watched the flames and said quietly, May I warm myself by your fire?" And the two of them sat there in silence, watching the sun rise over the endless plains. Because in the vast desert of the frontier, one truth always remains. Sometimes a small act of kindness doesn't just warm a cold night, it changes the direction of an entire life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider sharing it with your friends who might appreciate a heartfelt Western tale. We would also love to know where you're watching from. Leave the name of your city in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can see how far our stories travel.